Everybody, to my ongoing look at the life and the music of late reggae producer Lee "Scratch" Perry. 1976 and 1977 had been massive years for Perry, seeing his productions reach a worldwide audience through his deal with Island Records and resulting in a number of classic albums being produced by him. 1978 seems set to follow in much the same pattern. However, events would unfold over the year that would see Perry's life take a dramatic left turn and crumble everything he had built over the previous decade plus down to the foundations. In 1977, he had begun working with a vocal duo, the falsetto-voiced Cedric Myton and tenor-voiced Roydell Johnson, aka Congo Ashanti Roy. Perry dubbed them the Congos, but felt their harmonies were missing something, so he added his old friend, the deep baritone-voiced Wattie Burnett, to the group and began crafting a series of sides on which Perry would deploy the full array of talent he had available at the Black Ark, songs that were spiritual, cultural in nature, transcendent, mystical even. Some of these songs would surface as 7 and 12-inch singles in 1977 and finally be compiled as an LP called Heart of the Congos, which initially surfaced in Jamaica in 1977 with some early copies bearing hand-painted stripes done by artist Jaw Wise, who also did some painting and decorating in the studio itself. Wattie Burnett, not pictured on the cover here, as he was away on vacation at the time the photos were taken. Heart of the Congos, Lee Perry justifiably proud of this material. It was the sum total of everything he had done with the Black Ark to this point. He was very hopeful for it to see a wider international release through Island Records. Chris Blackwell had expressed interest in the group. Perry had traveled to London to finalize a deal in late 1977, and Blackwell and his lawyer would also travel to Jamaica early in 1978. Everything seemed set for Heart of the Congos to see a deserved international release. However, for unexplained reasons, perhaps sensing reticence on the part of Island Records toward the project, Perry went back to the album and extensively remixed it, so subsequent pressings would be radically different from the early ones. He would add copious amounts of percussion, more tape delay, crashing cymbals, and most startlingly, the sound effect of a mooing cow in certain spots. The mooing cow, actually a sound produced by Wattie Burnett blowing through the inner cardboard tube of a tinfoil roll. Perry thought the sound was funny, caught it on tape, and would add it to a number of his productions through 1978. While Perry was hoping and waiting for the Congos project to be finalized, to be released internationally on Island Records, he would continue releasing a number of deep roots, sides, classic, rare Black Ark tracks by established artists and little-known acts, mainly of a very cultural nature, commenting on the situation in Jamaica at that time as the economic crisis grew ever worse, unemployment reaching an all-time high, food prices going up, food shortages. The situation was getting desperate, and many of these songs released by Lee Perry in 1978 would reflect this, reflect his growing spiritual commitment to Rastafari. As with the influence of the Congos, he had begun growing dreadlocks himself after many years regarding it as unnecessary. Some of these sides Perry would record through the year would be Traveling by the little-known Deborah Keese, female singer, singing about her experience within the spiritual journey of Rastafari. A harmony group called the Mystic Eyes with Forward with Jah Orthodox. Mystic Eyes were a harmony group led by lead singer Anthony Johnson. Perry would also voice his own Baffling Smoke Signal, giving its title to a Heartbeat compilation some years ago. Baffling Smoke Signal taking aim at the Pope and the Vatican. Perry would also begin working with a JBC radio presenter named Michael Campbell, who had a notorious and highly popular radio program called Dread at the Controls, where he would mix dub on live on air, throw in recorded jingles. He would come around to Perry's Black Ark studio to get exclusive material for his show, and Perry would produce some sides with Michael Campbell, aka Mikey Dread, as he transitioned from a radio presenter into an artist in his own right through songs such as Dread at the Controls over Perry's Dreadlocks in Moonlight rhythm track. Michael Campbell, Mikey Dread, would also record further songs, very early songs of his for Perry, including Schoolgirls and Home Guard. Very early days of January 1978 saw the always tense political situation in Jamaica once again make headline news on the island. Both major political parties surreptitiously employed street-level gangs of enforcers to shore up support in neighborhoods called garrisons, controlled by them, and to destabilize and attack neighborhoods controlled by the other party. On the day of January 5th, 1978, several men affiliated with the conservative opposition Jamaican Labour Party were lured out to the military base near Green Bay on pretext of obtaining automatic weapons. Once there, they were opened fire on by members of the Jamaican military, the JLP's arch rival, the People's National Party, in power, controlling the military at this time. At the end of it, no mercy given, 5 men lay dead. Among them was an aspiring singer named Glenn Roy Richards. Some did manage to escape. The Green Bay Massacre, as it came to be known, caused a furor on the island, inspired a number of songs commenting on the situation. Lee Perry was one of the first, recording a little-known DJ called Lord Sassafras on a song called Green Bay Incident. In the aftermath of the massacre, 2 opposing gang leaders by the names of Claudie Massop and Bucky Marshall had ended up in jail together in the same cell. While there, the 2 erstwhile enemies got to talking, realized they had more in common than they suspected. Both were pawns in the seemingly never-ending cycle of violence, this shell game between the 2 political parties, and that both of them, in the long run, were ultimately expendable. Once out of jail, they arranged for a meeting, and after long hours of negotiation, they arrived at what came to be known as the Peace Treaty of 1978, calling for a ceasefire to the years of gang-related bloodshed that had brought strife to the streets of Kingston. This, in turn, would inspire a number of songs celebrating the ceasefire, and to consolidate the treaty, they arranged for the One Love Peace Concert to be held in Kingston in April 1978. To rectify what had happened with the Smile Jamaica concert earlier, when headliner Bob Marley had been targeted for assassination by one of the political gangs, they wanted him to return to the island and headline the concert. Marley wanted assurances he would no longer be a target, he and his family would be safe, and then he agreed to headline the concert. Toward the end of February 1978, he arrived back on the island, having not returned since the attempt on his life, having been in exile overseas. He soon reunited with Lee Perry. They began working on some material together, songs such as Buffalo Soldier, Rastaman Live Up, and Black Man Redemption, working not at Perry's Black Ark, but at Dynamic and Aquarius Studios. Perry introduced them to a harmony group called the Meditations he had been working with. He had recorded a couple of songs from their debut album at the Ark. He had added some of their harmonies to some of Bob Marley's songs, but they had not met in person to that point. Perry was hoping to do a full album with the Meditations. He had recorded some songs with them, such as the blistering No Peace, which would be rejected by Island for release as a 12-inch single internationally, along with Houses of Parliament and a song called Much Smarter, Thinks, aka Think So. A song called Life Is Not Easy, backed with Much Smarter, would appear on Island as a 12-inch single. Life Is Not Easy was actually recorded at Channel 1 Studios, but would be brought to Perry's Black Ark for further mixing. He would add that mooing cow song he was so fond of to it. That one would appear as a 12-inch single. However, a full album with the Meditations would not materialize. Another song commenting on the political situation in Jamaica at this time, the Peace Treaty, was a self-produced song recorded at the Ark by singer Kiddus I, whose song Graduation in Zion featured on the Rockers film. Security in the Streets, released on Kiddus I's own Shepherd label as a 12-inch single, would comment on the situation of police and gang members and the cessation of violence in the streets of Jamaica. Recorded at the Ark, though produced by the artist himself. The artist Bob Marley would go on to headline the One Love Peace concert, the legendary concert held in April 1978, when he would bring the two opposing political leaders, Prime Minister Michael Manley and opposition leader Edward Seaga, both visibly uncomfortable, bring them on stage and join their hands together in a sign of unity, though the peace treaty itself would ultimately fail.
There is a feeling of security out in the streets and now. People are walking free now as never before, and they never needed no security forces to do this. We took a little bit of loveliness to get together now.
Through 1978, Lee Perry would become involved in a number of projects that frustratingly were not completed or went awry due to a variety of factors, some of them involving the female backing vocalists known as Full Experience. Singer Ora Lewis, originally from South Africa, had come to Jamaica as a backing singer for Jimmy Cliff, had added some vocals to Lee Perry's production of Bob Marley's Punky Reggae Party, and had gone on to form the Full Experience with American Pamela Reed, adding their harmony textures to a number of Lee Perry productions beginning in 1977. When joined by UK-based singer Candy McKenzie of Guyanese heritage, who had been sent to the Ark by Island Records to record an album with Perry, they became a trio. Lewis seeing the Full Experience as representative of the black female experience with members from Africa, from America, and from the Caribbean. They began working on their own solo material for Lee Perry, but the project unraveled due to some romantic entanglements that were going on. Perry himself reportedly having amorous feelings for Pamela Reed, despite the presence of his wife and his family on the property. The Black Ark studio, of course, located at the back of his home. His album with Candy McKenzie, who had solo ambitions of her own, would never be released at the time, would finally appear in 2011 On a Trojan CD, Lee Perry presents Candy Mackenzie, at the time only a limited 12-inch, with her cover of Breakfast in Bed and Disco Fits, would be released in a very limited edition. The singer herself unaware it had come out until the mid-1980s. Ora would finally get frustrated at the tension-fraught situation, would go back to her old boss, Jimmy Cliff, and ask him to intervene to pay Scratch as a producer and take over control of the tapes, which Jimmy Cliff agreed to do. Perry took great umbrage at this. He was at this intervention in his project, would finally wash his hands of the affair and give a poorly mastered set of tapes to Jimmy Cliff. However, again, it would not see release at the time. Of the nearly a dozen songs completed, only 5 would belatedly appear overseas, as Ora Meets Lee Perry, finally re-released on this Sunspot edition from several years ago. But again, frustratingly incomplete, only 5 of the nearly a dozen songs completed. This was a mix of reggae with some deep bass lines laid down by Boris Gardner, with some traditional African textures and some R&B and soul, highlighted by a somewhat tongue-in-cheek cover of Nina Simone's Young, Gifted and Black as Young, Gifted and Broke, and the title track Full Experience, with a sprawling chorus line and a deep bass line from Boris Gardner. But frustratingly, the project would be shelved before being fully realized. Project Perry became involved with in 1978 involved a little-known harmony group called the Jolly Brothers, who had a song called Conscious Man, a love song with some Rasta-oriented biblical overtones that piqued Perry's interest. He recorded the song at the Ark, and when released in the UK, it reached the British charts, did well in Europe as well, and prompted the UK labels Perry was releasing his product with to commission a full album produced by Perry. However, some conflicts arose between those labels, would lead to the project being delayed. The eventual album would finally be completed by Prince Jammy at another studio and be released as Consciousness, including the Lee Perry produced Conscious Man, but most other tracks recorded elsewhere. The material Perry recorded with the group would not be released until several years later and belatedly appear in the 1990s as Lee Perry presents the Jolly Brothers, Conscious Man, released on the Seven Leaves label, with the material finally surfacing in the early 1980s and then the LP in the early 1990s. This is roots and culture material by a lesser-known harmony group, the Jolly Brothers. brothers would add harmonies to another project Lee Perry was working on at the same time as his sessions for them. And while he waited for news of whether Island Records would release Heart of the Congos internationally, he began working with a couple of musicians originally from the Congo itself. Seskane Molengo and Kelo Kawangolo had been in France, where they got in touch with an executive with CBS Records France named Nadette Duguay. Together, they concocted a scheme to go to Jamaica, record an album together, and in a series of convoluted circumstances, ended up at Lee Perry's Black Ark studio. Lee Perry, intrigued by the possibility of blending reggae with African rhythms and traditional percussion, much of roots reggae, Rastafari, looking to the African continent anyway as its spiritual homeland, cultural motherland. He became intrigued by the possibility of this fusion and embarked on the project with the two Congolese musicians and his regular Black Ark crew. However, the project dragged on, the two African musicians working at a very slow pace. The French executive, Nadette Duguay, met the Congos, noticed they were much more professional, much more efficient than the African musicians she had brought to Jamaica, offered them a contract to leave Lee Perry and go to France to record an album for her. The Congos, meanwhile, were frustrated at their debut album, Heart of the Congos, being held in limbo, only released in Jamaica to that point. This masterwork they had poured so much of time and care and their best songs into, and elected to go with Nadette Duguay back to France to record an album. There had also been some personal conflicts going on between the members of the Congos and Lee Perry. Lee Perry, bitterly stung by what he saw as their betrayal. Only Waddy Burnett, reluctant to leave his friend Lee Perry, but felt he had to stick with the group. The Congos would travel to France and record the Congo album for CBS France, released on Columbia. A fine follow-up, but not quite of the same impossibly high standard as Heart of the Congos. They would also release it on their own Congo Ashanti label, simply titled Congo. Congo Ashanti, the three Congos, departing Lee Perry and his Black Ark under tense circumstances. Perry gave them a master copy of the second mix of Heart of the Congos, which would be belatedly released internationally, would never receive the widespread release internationally on Island Records, would take many years to be acknowledged as a classic. Author of Bass Culture, Lloyd Bradley, has called it the greatest roots reggae album ever made. Both mixes of the album, by the way, have been released on this CD from VP Records from 2017. Contains the original, more restrained mix, and then the later full-on Lee Perry mix, as well as collecting non-album sides, alternative 12-inch mixes. The album Heart of the Congos would be released a couple of years later. It would appear in France in a pressing and on the Go Feet label in the UK, selling very well. Members of The Beat, who are behind the Go Feet label, big fans of the album. And finally, it would belatedly achieve international classic status through a 1990s reissue, lovingly curated by Blood and Fire Records out of the UK. In the meantime, Lee Perry continued working on the African project with Seskane Molenga and Kelo Kawangolo. Sessions dragged on for quite a long time, would not be released properly until 1979. He gave a poorly mastered mix to the African musicians, washed his hands of the project when they left Jamaica to travel back overseas, and it would appear in 1979 in a poor sounding pressing on Son Afrique label in France. It's been reissued not too long ago on Planet Ilunga label as Roots from the Congo. Traditional African rhythms with Black Ark roots reggae. Lee Perry's African connection, Roots from the Congo. prior to his acrimonious split with the Congos, Lee Perry was working on 2 solo albums of his to be released in 1978. The first, which was released in Jamaica in April of that year, was Roast Fish, Collyweed, and Cornbread. Astonishingly, this would be the first album to feature Lee Perry entirely as lead vocalist and would be released on his Lion of Judah label, as well as Upsetter in Jamaica. This is a recent reissue from VP Records. Roast Fish and Cornbread. The title track had already been released internationally by Island Records. Perry would remix it for this album and add the mooing cow sound effect he was so fond of in 1978. Elsewhere, he would include some political and social commentary songs, as in Free Up the Weed and Ghetto Sidewalk, commenting on the lack of public services in ghetto neighborhoods. Big Neck Police would revise his Dreadlocks in Moonlight rhythm track, as well as he would include some dietary advice for a healthy lifestyle on the title track and Favorite Dish. Perhaps the most startling was the lead-off track, Soul Fire. Soul Fire, and We Ain't Got No Water, perhaps giving a hint as to the turmoil, the anguish Lee Perry was feeling in 1978. He would also update Curly Locks, his big hit with Junior Biles from several years before, and the back cover photo showing the members of the Congos and the full experience outside the Ark in happier times shortly before their departure from Lee Perry's life. The second album that would be released in Jamaica in summer 1978 was a follow-up to his masterpiece Super Ape, which Island had released in 1976. Return of the Super Ape, credited to the Upsetters, would again appear in Jamaica on his Lion of Judah and Upsetters labels, and similar to the original Super Ape would be a melange of vocals, both by other artists, by Perry himself, in somewhat of a scatting stream of consciousness style, and dub textures, all seamlessly blended together to make a true follow-up to the original and deserved masterpiece, Super Ape. Perhaps most startling was a song called Bird in Hand, with a hallucinogenic vocal by little-known singer Sam Carty, who is of part Indian extraction. It was based on a Bollywood song from the 1950s called Milti Hi Akanen, and revised at the Ark as Bird in Hand. There was a full vocal version recorded, which was released on a 10-inch single on the Raka Shaka label out of Japan. Milta Hi Akanen. The version that appeared on the Return of Super Ape album switches to dub partway through. As well, there would be a somewhat rollicking version of Rufus's R&B hit, Tell Me Something Good, a worthy follow-up to the Super Ape LP. Lee Perry was hoping for both those albums to be released for Island Records, but as with Heart of the Congos, as with the Roots from the Congo project, which he had submitted to Island for consideration, Island Records would decline to issue both those solo albums from Lee Perry. He was very proud of those works, was very stung. His productions were perhaps getting too experimental to be played in a dance in Kingston on a Friday or Saturday night, but they had registered well with the rock crowd and reggae crowds internationally through Island Records. Now he was sensing a lot of reluctance on the part of Island to release his music, and he was becoming very rejected, feeling very rejected, very stung by their refusals to issue these works that he had created through 1977 and into 1978 that he was very proud of.
Clappity, 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 high. Clip, clap. Clappity, 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 high. Roast fish and cornbread. Hey, hey, hey. Roast fish and cornbread. Yeah. Roast fish and cornbread. Yeah.
As professional and personal setbacks continued to plague Lee Perry through 1978, betrayals by those he thought close to him, the stress began to take its toll. He was under increasing pressure from a number of sources, a number of mouths expecting to be fed, both in his extended family, his circle of friends, especially as his productions with Bob Marley did well internationally. There were reportedly gangsters shaking him down for protection money. There was a sect of Rastas that became a fixture at the Ark, wanted to involve him in their various schemes and projects. It all became too much. He was working at the same breakneck pace he had been keeping up for some time now, rarely stopping to sleep or eat, subsisting on a steady diet of alcohol and ganja. His behavior began to get more eccentric as his state of mind started to unravel. He had always had a certain eccentricity. He had always been a little different. So it became difficult for those close to him to ascertain whether this was something new or something to be alarmed about or merely part of his established pattern of behavior. But he began to get more eccentric, more extreme in his behavior, covering the walls of the Ark with elaborate graffiti as he became focused on the spiritual connotations of certain words and letters, becoming convinced that the letter X represented the devil and scrawling it in magic marker or paint all over every available surface of the Ark in what must have taken hours, even covering it over staplers. But he continued working on new music for a time, reuniting with Bob Marley to work on songs like Who Colt the Game and I Know a Place that would not surface for many years to come. He embarked on a project with the Nyabingi drumming-based group Ras Michael and the Sons of Negus on songs that would take on somewhat of the psychedelic reggae flavor that they had earlier done on the Dadawa project. But as his state of mind continued to unravel, various developments would take place in his personal life. His behavior became too extreme for his common-law wife, Pauline. At one point, he threw out the meal she was cooking and threw out brand new groceries and put a pot of rocks to cook on the stove. Fearing for her own sanity, she left the relationship, established her own place of residence, and embarked on a relationship with Danny Clark, singer of the Meditations, whom Perry had produced. Perry saw this as yet another personal betrayal, becoming bitter against the Rastas, which Danny Clark and the Congos represented to him. He began a series of bitter confrontations with the musicians and the artists who frequented the Ark, one by one chasing them off as his behavior became more and more erratic. Finally, Ras Michael and the Sons of Negus retrieved the tapes they were working on from the Ark, would complete the project elsewhere. It would finally be released in America on the Live and Love label as Love Thy Neighbor. The Perry produced sides showing stunning focus, stunning majesty, and hinting at what might have been had the project been fully completed, as it was one of the last works to emerge from the Ark as the atmosphere became demoralized and slowly began to unravel as 1978 wound down to a close. Pauline Morrison eventually summoned the children to come stay with her. For a time, they would shuttle back and forth between the family home at 5 Cardiff Crescent and Pauline's new residence. Finally, the children would eventually return to 5 Cardiff Crescent, in part to keep an eye on their father, on his increasingly fragile state of mind. But one by one, he ran off all his friends, associates, all the musicians and artists he had worked with. There were projects that would never be released to this day. A proposed second album with Junior Mervyn would never surface, except for the odd song. A proposed second album with singer George Faith would never be realized. Perry was in an increasingly precarious state of mind, would finally find himself alone as all of the troubling elements that were plaguing his state of mind and represented to him by the individuals in his life. He ran all of them off one by one. By the end of January 1979, the Ark was a far cry from what it had been a year before, a bustling place of recording, still functional, but virtually deserted. The interior completely covered with graffiti that now absorbed its owner's full mental capabilities as he took his eyes off music. It was the end of the Black Ark, which had produced some of the most stunning and majestic music reggae had ever produced, that Jamaica had ever produced, and the man Lee Scratch Perry, who had entered the 1970s, would exit it a very different man altogether. This has been my look at the year 1978 in the life of Lee Perry. Stay tuned for further chapters. Thanks for watching, guys.
I wonder why so much people die. Sometimes I wonder why so much people sit and cry. Should this evil system